Today is Navin Sharma, Head of Product for the CMDB, who'll be presenting to us the great work that our team is doing for ServiceNow's customers. In addition, we're also joined by my colleague, Emir Eminovich, who'll be assisting in any Q&A you may have during the session. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Now, without further ado, Navin, the floor is yours. Please share your screen and take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Navin Sharma, and I lead the CMDB and Service Graph product management team. Today, we have roughly 60 minutes together, and what I will cover is going to be CMDB best practice. What I'll start off doing is, focusing a little bit of time in terms of what is the CMDB and giving a quick peek at what are the new functionality that's coming in the San Diego release. After that, we'll spend some time on the CMDB data model, right? And again, CMDB data model is sort of a core understanding, is a core requirement to really understand how to best configure the CMDB. And then we'll spend the majority of the time talking about really the goal of configuring and creating a process and tooling such that CMDB becomes sustainable over the long run. Two key points I want to make sure I point to. Number one is that there's going to be a lot of content that's going to be covered, but luckily this presentation is getting recorded. So, if you get the chance, please come back and review it and don't feel too overwhelmed if there's too much stuff and you're not able to follow. Second is that, we did a presentation a couple of months ago focused on really CMDB vision, strategy, and roadmap. I would highly recommend going and referring to that as well, which is in the forum that, Tony mentioned earlier, right? And then what we'll continue to do is we'll also ask you for a little bit more feedback on the session, right? And this session got set up because the overwhelming response last time was that our customers really wanted a best practice session. If there are other things you want to deep dive on and focus on, please provide that feedback, and we'll make sure we bring that to you. Okay, so let's focus on sort of the basics of the CMDB. What is a CMDB? The term CMDB obviously has been around for quite a long time, and but the CMDB of ServiceNow is quite unique. The way I like to describe it is that it is really where you will store people, process, technology, data all tied to and connected to each other, right? And then you layer on things like the actual services and products that a company is sort of providing to its internal and external customers. What makes it so unique is that it's all under the notion of a single data model, where end-to-end coverage from the life cycle of plan, build, operate, service within the same database. One kind of a euphemism I always use here is that if I had to rename the CMDB, I'd actually call it the silo buster database, because again, it's really about all these different parts of an organization all coming in with a single data view end to end. So let's talk about how does it help in terms of driving an outcome, right? And the key there is that the CMDB data is used across pretty much everything in ServiceNow. And somebody asked, hey, do you need a healthy CMDB to actually run some of these things? The answer is no. But when you have a healthy CMDB, you actually get a lot more value from them. And an example here could be, somebody's doing IT asset management and they want to do, software asset reclamation, right? The CMDB provides that data to make that successful. It could be somebody's doing ITSM, and then CMDB is really where, you log change against, you get the understanding of impact. And then similarly, when you have an incident, that you can actually action that incident, understand priority, and understand ownership, right? That's all sort of driven from having a robust CMDB data. And if you look at other items such as cloud or DevOps, the concept is very similar, right? That having that unified data model really enables you to automate and action things. And again, for the modern technology stack, just means that type of CIs may be different, how often you insert them may be different, but the overall concept is still absolutely consistent and similar. So let's now move on to the CMDB data model. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to talk deep dive, in the weeds, but I definitely want to give a high level overview of what it is, so you have a good sense of, going forward. So what exactly is in the CMDB, right? The way I like to talk about it is there's really two key pieces within the CMDB, right? I'd say maybe three different pieces here within the CMDB today. One is sort of the infrastructure data. And when I say infrastructure, that means applications, that could mean servers, that could mean cloud resources, that could mean containers, but it's a physical or logical, entity that's actually running, right? And then second, it's not just the single entity, but it's also the relationship. So meaning it's the, Tomcat WAR that's running on a server that's connected to a database, right? So that's kind of the data you have from the infrastructure perspective. The second piece is that is connected to what we call foundational data. Think about foundation data as, like who's the essentially user groups, users, locations, right? All of these other common data that's, within a ServiceNow platform that is, kind of very, very much related to the CMDB. And the final item here is like, this is part of the CMDB, but there's also sort of business constructs, on top of sort of the infrastructure data, right? Think of this as, application services, think of this as business applications, think of this as service offerings, right? Those are essentially sort of a higher level construct that sort of group a lot of the capabilities you have from an infrastructure perspective, to drive a lot of more, kind of facilitate a lot of automation as well as make that simpler to manage, essentially, right? So that's really what makes up, kind of what's in the CMDB today, right? So if you double click on the foundation data, right, like I mentioned, it's very related to the CMDB, but it's not part of the CMDB, right? Most of the time they're located in something called, CMN underscore table, right? And they could be like, in this example, like, location, cost center, department. And then similarly, there are also things, with a sys underscore, and those are all sys user and, group tables, right? And the key takeaway from this is that, you absolutely need to make sure you have an understanding of how these data are coming in, where are you getting your users, and how are you making sure that your user, your location, your company tables are also sort of managed properly, so they don't become, just smorgasbord of just, random data points. Right. And if you look at the CMDB, right, when I say CMDB, it really refers to CMDB underscore CI is where all the tables within CMDB really live, right? And then what really happens is that within the CMDB, it's actually referencing back all these common, data points that I mentioned, right? In terms of sys users, in terms of sys user groups, right? Along the same lines, we also sort of have a reference to when you say ALM asset. Right? And those are really asset management records and CMDB models, which are also really, very, very relevant for asset management, right? And like I said, they're not part of the CMDB. They're very, very related and very much required for successful implementation. So double clicking a little bit on relationship. What does relationship mean? Relationship is really the notion of, connecting two different CIs. They generally fall under, different types of relationship types that you have. Example, runs on, virtualized by virtualizes. But at the very core is really sort of, trying to get a parent-child relationship to figure out, when something goes down, what's the impact radius, right? That's how we sort of can articulate, that dependency. And one question we get a lot is like, okay, how do we actually maintain and add these relationships, right? And for the most part, I have not seen companies be successful manually trying to manage a relationship, right, across infrastructure. You definitely need to do that in terms of the higher level construct, right? But when you're really talking about the core infrastructure level, you want to rely on automated tools to do this. If you have something like Discovery or Service Graph Connector, it will automatically add the relationship. What relationship is added really depends on what the source is. Right. So again, even if you're not using Discovery Service Graph Connector, I highly recommend, leveraging something like IHETL, which does help you, bring in some of these relationship and map them very, very easily. But again, right, pay attention to your source and just understand what relationship do they bring and how is that going to really help me with, drive some of the outcomes I have in mind. So moving on, right? If you look at the CMDB CI that I showed you before, right? There's more than 167 attributes, right? Do you need all of them? No. So the key here would be, you need to understand a little bit of, what you're trying to do and figure out, okay, what are the attributes you absolutely need? So here, what I have a list of it is that what I consider to be must-have, right? And I deem that if you don't have some of these things, then, fundamentally there's something, you cannot get right. And let me explain all of these, one at a time. So the first three I'll call out is sort of name, serial number, and MAC address, right? And the subset of those would be like process name, object ID. ID would be another one in there as well, depending on if it's a cloud resource or not, right? Or if it's an application or not, right? But the net here is that those, three items are really foundational in terms of identifying something, right? When a CI comes in, all the logic we're going to use to say, hey, is this the same CI? Is it already exist? Or do we need to create a new one, or do we not create anything, right? Is really determined by, some variation of those three attributes, right? So those are must-haves. Second is, what I call out here is lifecycle stage and status. So think about stage and status as really the, reflecting some kind of operational status of that CI, right? And this is also very, very important. And this is actually something new field that's been introduced, right? We used to have, operational status, hardware status, right? So we're sort of combining all those into this unified lifecycle stage and status. And I'll talk about in a bit in terms of, kind of the best practice in terms of what to do and what are some of the functionality we have to actually get on that journey. So second, set of attributes here are, again, discoverable for the most part, right? But it'd be something like manufacturer model number. And I put in there because, again, asset management is highly, highly, highly important, in terms of a lot of use cases customers do, right? And these two are, become pretty much a requirement to get that correct. And the final two is sort of location and environment, right? Location, as the name implies, is just where is this, asset, logical or physical, located, right? And those can sort of be driven from, different tooling in terms of looking at the IP ranges. There are some integrations that will actually provide this data for you, right? But this may also be something you would need to maintain manually, right? And then the final item here is environment, and that's really talking about, is this prod, is this sub-prod, is this dev, right? Is this ring 1, ring 2, what have you? And the concept here is, again, there are some toolings, depending on what you're integrating with, that can bring this input, but this is also something you may have to really kind of add yourself, right? And the final item here is all the things we call non-discoverable attributes, right? And these are things that, for the most part, you cannot get directly from different tools, right? In fact, this is where you're sort of really managing data within ServiceNow. And these things are something like a support group, right? Which is really about who's going to actually support, when there's an issue. Managed by group, which is really foundationally about who's going to actually manage this CI as a record entity, right? And it's something new, but highly important in terms of having, accountability and longevity of CMDB. Third one is change group, as the name implies, is, used to be called assignment group. This is like who actually approves when a change record is created, right? And the final item here is not an attribute per se, but is actually a type of CI, which is called information object, right? And this is, for the most part, linked to a business application. And this is where you would actually specify, your criticality of an application or PCI or HIPAA requirements, right? And how this would work is like you'd specify the criticality in business application, you'd connect to an application service, and you'd have the infrastructure supporting that, within the application service. And then those infrastructure components really get the criticality, get the HIPAA compliance from, the information object, rather than sort of managing them individually at the CI level, right? Again, very, very fundamentally important and required in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So one point that I cannot have any conversation on CMDB without mentioning is that I always get a question of, what's the difference between CMDB and asset, right? And key is that even though they're very, very related, they're actually two different tables, right? And think about, just the notion of what is an asset, right? The asset record really gets created once you have a demand, right? And it gets more and more data as you go through the asset lifecycle, right? When at the point where you actually have something deployed, it becomes a CI, right? And that CI lifecycle, again, can actually have multiple lifecycle, for a single asset lifecycle, right? Meaning that, you may have an asset that became a revenue generating server, right? And that revenue generating server eventually got decommissioned, right? And now you're going to use that same hardware for, again, making into an email server, the example, right? So there's really two different CI in terms of lifecycle, right? But net, the asset was still singular, it was still the same. And we have a lot of things within ServiceNow in terms of syncing data between, between asset and CMDB, and also sort of making sure some of the lifecycle stage shares are synced, right? And key takeaway here is that do pay attention. They're not one and the same. And when you delete one or the other, do understand like a repercussion of what that happens to either one of the life cycles. So let's get into finally sort of the data governance piece, right? And like I mentioned before, what I want to do here is really prescriptively walk in terms of the key steps, that we need to do in terms of getting success, right? And then follow that through in terms of what are the toolings we have in place to make that a reality. So one quick anecdote here is like, so before you do anything, kind of understanding use case, process alignment, and org alignment is, I would say, the number one reason I have heard customers talk about not getting value out of the CMDB, right? And over the years of talking to customers on just, implementing and realizing value, these are for me like foundational pieces that need to be figured out ahead of time. And really, in a use case, what it really means is that a lot of times I see customers, think about boiling the ocean and not necessarily having an outcome in mind, right? And then when you're trying to sort of boil the ocean, it's likely that you're going to fail, right? Second is sort of process alignment. Like I mentioned before, right? Getting the data into the CMDB is really the first part. You really need to have, process in terms of maintaining that data over time, right? And really having understanding of who owns it, who are the stakeholders who are sort of deeply involved with that. And this doesn't mean you need 50 people meeting every day, looking at every CI, but there's some basic things you need to do and let some of the workflow and some of the automation we have to solve those problems for you. Third is really org alignment, which really means, the reality is that when you want to maintain a CMDB, it's not going to be, a single person or single team that can do it, right? It's really going to be across the board. Different people own the different data, and different people really are driving different outcomes. And how do you make sure you're sort of aligned so that you're sort of doing things in stepwise motion, right? And a great example, like I'm just trying to think of it would be, a great use case would be like if a customer comes in and say, hey, I'm sort of starting my CMDB or redoing some of my, trying to get into a healthier state. And maybe they start with saying, my use case is that I'm going to look at all the computers, meaning PC, Macs or laptops, and I'm actually going to do software asset management and focus on license management for those, right? And there, what we said is like we focus on a use case, not everything. So a particular type of class, we're going to get a particular type of data to run the outcome of, hey, can I manage the license that I'm spending? And a goal would be, hey, I'm sort of able to take down some efficiencies, right? The process here would be alignment would require, okay, now you need to sort of specify what are the data points that I need. In this example, it'd be like, okay, I need to get somehow notion of what are the computers that I have in my enterprise. Second, you need to align in terms of understanding what data types, right? It could be like install software and usage, right? And the final point you want to understand from this process alignment as well is that invariably you will have data issues, and so how do you figure out who do you work with, how do you work with to get that correct, right? And one other item here is like when you think about the data source, in this example, right, you probably thought about SCCM, right, or JAMF as being good data sources. And here, the nuance here is like, it's highly unlikely the CMDB team owns those data sources, right? It's going to be the server team, the compute team, right? The Mac team owning those data sources. So now how do you make sure we have an org level alignment in terms of understanding, hey, I need this data for this outcome. When there's data issues, here's how we figure that out jointly. And then sort of asset management folks are there to understand, okay, this is sort of the life cycle of the data and making sure that aligns with the processes they have in place, right? So when you think about all these together, then you're sort of really set up for success. So next would be, once you have sort of the process in terms of like, I figured out the use case, I figured out the data, I have a way to get the data, I have a way to manage the data. Once you've sort of hammered that down, the next sort of 5 things we like to talk through, it'd be, first is ingest. And this is talking about identify at a deeper level, what are the classes, identifying what are the data sources, identifying what are the attributes I need to bring in, right? That's step 1. Step 2 is reconcile. And this really focuses on, okay, now I have the data, how do you make sure I am not, kind of bringing garbage in, garbage out, right? Meaning, how do I make sure I'm not creating duplicates? How do I identify, how do I reconcile different data points coming in, right? And this is something you need to think about, right? Out of the box, there's a lot of capabilities already, but again, it's not something you can just take for granted. So I would highly recommend at least understanding what ServiceNow does in this space. And then I'll go deep dive on this subject as well in a few. Third aspect would be data lifecycle. And like I said, right, a great example here would be, like for containers, right, would be, a container could come in, it's operationally useful for a little bit, but then after a while, you don't necessarily want to have it in the CMDB, right? So now how do I figure out an operational aspect of making that a reality, right? So this really ensures like, hey, do we have ownership defined for these? Do we have the right life cycle stage defined for these? And then finally, do I have sort of an automated policy created such that this can become a reality? A third point is a data completeness, right? And what this means is that, for the particular outcome you have in mind, example, like I want to do asset management on my software titles, right? Maybe you don't necessarily need a support group, right? But you definitely would maybe want to have something like a location or a user that would sort of help me kind of understand who is using what, and if I take away some licenses, who may be impacted, right? Just throwing that out there, right? So again, so just deciding what attributes are actually required, something you want to do. And then second would be figuring out a process whereby you can check for these critical attributes, right? And have a flow so that you can remediate them as they pop up, right? And again, this would be critical in the starting phase in terms of understanding what's required and how do you track it such that you have success down the line. And the final point is really about, auditing the data. One example I throw out there is like, hey, if customers want to find all Windows 95 servers, servers running Windows 95, how would you do it, right? And again, so the auditing piece is really going to be, determined on exactly what you're doing as a company and what audits or compliance requirements you have. But the point being, you need to sort of pay attention in terms of what are the things you want to monitor, right? And then importantly, making sure you're setting up the different automated toolings we have so that some of these things can be sort of flagged, remediated, right? And then continuously monitoring them, right? So the point is like, if you do these things together, the goal is like not to make it incredibly complicated and require 50 people to manage it, but rather, it's sort of define steps you can do and let some of the automated tooling help you achieve the outcome you need. Okay. I sort of just mentioned sort of the ingest piece, right? So going back to that, a couple of key pieces. Number one is really identify data sources and for the use case. And like I was mentioning before, if it's software asset management, you may need, like I said, computer and software titles. If it's something different, you may need to get some different data types, right? And similarly, based on that, you may need different data types. Or in this case, you may need something like a user, maybe you need group, right? Maybe you need location, but again, very much not just the CI, but also the foundational data you need to drive that use case. And then third piece is really about identifying how you're going to get the data, right? again, we have sort of out of the box things like, ServiceNow Discovery, ACC, or, lots of Service Graph connectors, right? And if you can, for some reason, use any three of these things, I would highly recommend leveraging Integration Hub ETL, right? And IHETL is really the de facto standard we've set in terms of ingesting data into ServiceNow. It uses the RTE engine. It uses IRE, right, in the backend, but it just gives you a very, very visual and very easy to kind of sort of a debugging IDE experience, right? Once you've done that, depending on the use case, one other key aspect here is really about registering application service. And again, application service is the concept about, logically grouping things together, right? Such that how they're being used from a business perspective, right? So it is absolutely critical to have application services created, right? And then filled with the actual CIs. And finally, have it all connected to more of a business application and service offering that are even higher level, business construct. And again, what we've tried to do is make this sort of wizard-driven, straightforward operation and not make it, kind of rocket science in terms of trying to get this correct. And the final item here that you need to pay attention for ingestion is really about defining sort of an ingestion schedule, right? And again, it could be push, it could be pull, it could be every day, every hour, every month, right? Really depending on the use case. What do you need the data for, and making sure you're setting up the right schedule such that you can be successful. So in terms of data sources, right? Again, like I mentioned, for one big piece we need to get right is for the foundational data. And for that, it's really about, for user groups, it's how do I get the LDAP data, AD data. For location, it could be, hey, I have my MapWise where I maintain my data, or it could be some ERP system where I have some other department or, company data, right? And the critical item here would be, please definitely make sure you're bringing them in and bringing them correctly. Second piece is a lot of the logical components that I talked about, right? And here again is that, we have provided sort of wizards and, step-by-step ways of creating these things, and I would highly recommend leveraging them, right? And we even have things like, CLIs and REST APIs if you really want to be fully automated and fully modern, right? That's also available, for you to use. And then from the actual discovered CI pieces, the recommendation here is that, it is going to be far easier for you to use out-of-the-box tooling like Discovery, like ACC, like Service Graph connectors, right? And then like ServiceNow is going to support these integrations, right? But again, for whatever reason, if that's not available to you, right, the recommendation would be to use Integration Hub ETL, right? And this again is going to just make your life a lot easier. So just focusing on the Integration Hub ETL, I had mentioned a little bit earlier, what it does is that it can do push or pull. It can connect to, Excel files. It can connect to different data sources by REST, by JDBC, right? And the net is going to be, you can sort of easily connect to a data source. It leverages the RTE engine, so it's highly performant and gives you a lot more out-of-the-box functionality. And then the final step here is that, you're going to leverage IRE under the cover so that whatever data you generate is going to be clean, and you're going to have a single way of sort of reconciling everything. And I'll talk about the reconciling step in a bit, right? Second item is Service Graph Connector, right? And then the gotcha here is that, we have a whole bunch of Service Graph Connector released where we're here, we have a lot of traction here in terms of customer usage, and we have a pretty robust roadmap. And we'll do another follow-up session just on this, but just be aware that, it is there for you to leverage. So third piece is sort of the application service creation population. And what I wanted to show you here is really the application service wizard, right? And again, it's obviously a free thing that's there, right? And what it helps you do is register an application service. It helps you populate the application service. Some are required, are paid things, others are free, right? And then finally, there's a dashboard that comes with it that really gives you impact, it keeps you track in terms of how are you in terms of your overall application service. Are there different things that should be within the application context? Do you have some orphan servers or infrastructure, right? It sort of points to problem areas as well. And this overall keeps you, sort of helps you sort of keep track of where you are in your journey. So what does reconcile really mean? Reconcile really is about, when you have the same data source or multiple data sources bringing in data, how do we ensure we're not creating duplicates, right? Or overriding each other? And this is really about, kind of where the IRE comes in, right? IRE is sort of the reconciliation engine that makes sure that you're getting, clean data, and it's sort of doing the gatekeeping for the data as it comes to the CMDB, right? And the key core concept is that if you send every data, every source to the IRE, then you have a single gatekeeper that can really, really make sure, garbage doesn't get into the CMDB, right? So that's number one. So number 2 point in terms of, kind of the reconciliation is really about tracking your data health. And there's really 2 things here that I'll talk about. One is using CMDB health dashboard, right? And then second is really focusing on CMDB and CSDM, data foundation dashboard. Those things are your friends in terms of making and understanding where you are, and also making, different teams and different folks accountable for the data, right? Final item here is, what I'll talk about is sort of multi-source CMDB. And what this enables you to really is to get a bird's eye view, a double click of all the data coming in, and to understand if something is wrong, why is it wrong, and how do I fix it, right? So these are all things really, really, to be, very, very important to make sure you have this correctly. So again, so the identification rule as an example, right? It is about, identifying, which is, like I mentioned, right? It's really, it determines whether or not a CI is matching with an existing record. Is this a new record? Or third, do we even have enough data to create an actual record, right? Just because, you bring in the CMD data in the CMD doesn't necessarily mean it's good enough to actually, have, right? And the nuance here is like, bad data is always better than no data, right? Bad data is really kind of the crux of where things go wrong. And you really lose a lot of credibility when you have bad data. Second is reconciliation. And it is really about, given multiple sources bringing in data, how do I manage whose data, gets to be in the CMDB? And the key, kind of takeaway here is that, just because you have the same tools running on the same thing doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to bring in the same data, right? There's a lot of, temporal anomalies that happen whereby you're not going to get exactly the same thing. And then the final thing that IRE does is sort of, make sure the relationship integrity within the CMDB is preserved. And an example there would be like, if you're using like a Tomcat war with a server, right? How do I make sure, that I'm not inserting lots of Tomcats, right? And creating, duplicates, whereby the real way you want to identify a Tomcat war would have been, the server that's running on plus the actual process will identify something. Who does that checking, right? It is IRE, right? And then so the way to access IRE, as well as a lot of the class attributes and basic things, is through Class Manager, right? You go into Class Manager, it's, it's a single place to manage and understand a lot of the items I just mentioned. Next, so the identification rules, the good part here is that for most classes, there's already going to be out-of-box, identification rules, right? So it's not something you necessarily will need to sort of do yourself from scratch. It is going to be there, right? And the second point is, just make sure if you're going to change it, be very careful and do some basic sanity checks to make sure it's not going to, have adverse impact. And here, the key is that whenever you change an IRE rule, it impacts every source that's bringing data to the CMDB, right? Not just, maybe you're sort of trying to tweak something for a particular source. Keep in mind, Discovery would use this, Service Graph Connector uses this, anything with IHETL uses this, right? So just make that, kind of very clear. A couple other things is that a lot of the identification rules are hierarchical, right? What that really means is that, if you define on a CMDB CI, it's gonna, accrue to its child if you don't do anything on a child, but you can add child rules as well, which is going to override whatever parent rule you have, right? So again, there's some nuances here in terms of how this thing works. Do pay attention to them. Second is, the same thing you do in class manager, setting up reconciliation rule, right? And what I'm showing you here is like a screenshot of soon to be released San Diego, whereby you have the ability to do static rules, which is really saying per class, per attribute, you can define priority order in terms of who gets to write it. An example could be like, hey, you want the let's say the RAM value, you trust SECM, right? So that's number one. And maybe there's another, source X that you trust less, right? That would be, item 2 for some things, right? That's where you set it up. And then similarly, now there's an ability to sort of do reconciliation, dynamic reconciliation, which I mentioned before. It's really about you set up rules saying, it's the most reported value as an example, right? And the key with reconciliation is that out of the box, we do not populate it, right? It is completely empty, right? And then so what happens out of the box is like whichever source writes it last is what's gonna be the data value, right? So here again, you definitely want to pay attention and just, essentially either use dynamic rule or make it such that, your trusted sources are set up to write it to be the key, priority data source. And this again, follows hierarchy. So again, if you can set it up, once at the highest level of the CI, and it's going to follow through, right? And in each CI child class, you may set up differently depending on exactly what circumstance you're in. Final point here is on class manager and sort of looking at multi-source, right? So what multi-source does is that again, you can sort of go to the screen to sort of look at it, right? Look at the data. But what multi-source does is like, if you have a bunch of different data sources reporting on the CI, it actually captures that data under the covers, right? And what gives you is like, number one, really visibility in terms of, okay, if my data got corrupted, I can really tell you which attribute and which source corrupted it, number one, which is very, very valuable. Number two is that you actually have ability to sort of recompute, your CMDB. Like meaning, let's say your actual CMDB value in the RAM example, you ended up using, some, source X, and you realize, source X is actually garbage, right? So what you can do is simply go and recompute by changing the priority to SECM, and then CMDB will actually go and recompute itself in terms of, leveraging, the right data point. Right. And then finally, there is something called multi-source report builder as well. And this is really about understanding, obviously a lot of data gaps you may have and, coverage gaps you may have, right? But, from a data management perspective, this really gives you the ability to say, show me anytime SECM and, source X are not agreeing on RAM value, right? So you can sort of do these wide area sweeps and understand where's my data discrepancies. Is there some places where, some sources are reporting something completely different from others, right? And that's where it gives you a notion of, okay, these sources may not be reliable, and then I can, judicially do what I need, but to do all of that, you actually need that access to that data, right? And the final point here is that, we have something, called health dashboard, which to track your health, right, and your data health. And this again can be accessed through Class Manager. And there's 3 parts of it. I'll go through all of them, but let's focus on correctness, in terms of kind of the reconciliation is where that is impacted the most, right? And then in terms of correctness, there's 3 fields here, which is staleness, meaning, how old or new is your data, orphans, meaning, hey, these are sort of, the relation of integrity has been, compromised, or third is going to be really duplicate, right? And the key things takeaway here is, number one, turn your health, health data on. Second is that leverage sort of the health inclusion rules, right? And what this gives you is the ability to sort of start small and not to have, health run on everything. And one key thing I see customers do is like, they try to get a health on everything, right? And it's like, just it's needle in a haystack at that point, right? You're just going to be inundated with data. Rather really focus on, okay, if I'm doing asset management on computer class, let's only look at the health for the computer class. And now if I have a process of maintaining that data, I'm going to now turn on, some other class, right? To start small and then sort of go through that. And a couple things here to call out, right? In terms of staleness, right? You can define what does stale mean per class, right? Again, it's variable in terms of what staleness means, but again, gives you a good rule of thumb saying, hey, if I haven't touched something in 60 days or 90 days, maybe that thing is, something we need to pay attention to. Third is creating orphan rules. Again, what does it mean to be an orphan? What relationship do we care, right? We give you some of that flexibility in terms of setting that up. And with a lot of the, health dashboard items, one key item is that it does generate a score. And then second, you can actually generate follow-on tasks, right? So that it doesn't just become a dashboard. It's really like it actually becomes an actionable thing assigned to somebody, some team to go and remediate. Okay, let's get into the data lifecycle, right? And again, if you remember, data lifecycle is really about, once you have a CI and CMDB, right? Doesn't mean it's going to be accurate and required and operational throughout the lifecycle, right? A great example here would be like, we have customers who bring in, a lot of, container data, right? Again, container data have a value, for a short lifespan, right? But, after a couple of days or even like, even in maybe a week or so, right? They may not have any operational value. All they're doing is sort of clogging up the CMDB. And what we want to do is sort of define a policy saying, hey, terminated, containers after, I don't know, a week, go get archived so that you still have sort of an audit trail, right? But you're not necessarily having, thousands and millions of containers just for the sake of containers, right? But then now the question is like, okay, how do I actually make that operational in a reality, right? So that's really kind of what data lifecycle is all about. And the steps here is that, first you need to understand and align on through the data lifecycle, right? And some things like containers, again, have a specific lifecycle. Other things like a server may have a different lifecycle because again, it's not just a CI, but it is also an asset record tied to it, right? And there you just want to make sure you don't delete a CI, right? Or archive a CI and then have another asset being, created where you lose context of anything else that had gone to a CI before, it changed into a different CI, right? So that's really about identifying that lifecycle requirement. Second is, identify the data owners, right? Net here is like, some of these things you can obviously automatically do. Others you'd want somebody, some group to say, yeah, go for it. This makes sense, right? In terms of changing a lifecycle. And here, the recommendation is to use managed by group within the CI, right? And there's ways to automatically fill this managed by group in, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit, but again, best practice is like, do use them to be the kind of the guardian of lifecycle here. Third is going to be, setting up the lifecycle fields. We've had a lot of historic operational status, hardware status. We are going to, lifecycle stage and status going forward, right? It is highly recommended to go set that up. And then finally is you can now, once you've done this, you can sort of create a lifecycle policy with Data Manager, right? And then key takeaway here is that once you do it once, it sort of, continues on, right? Essentially in infinity, and you don't have to do this every time, right? So that's really the key in terms of making sure it's somewhat automated. So one key item here I want to talk about is, sort of the life cycle mapping, right? So what we used to have previously is that, folks had a lot of different life cycle attributes within a CI, right? And a lot of times they actually weren't even consistent with each other. They were causing a lot of issues in terms of connecting to the asset side of the house, right? So what we did was created something called stage and status, right? And stage and status are essentially choiceless, but they're fixed. We've gone through the pains of, I don't know, I didn't know how many customers we went through their life cycle in terms of making sure we had a complete set of stage status. And then what we give you is that ability to sort of first, when you turn on this lifecycle mapping, it gives you, here is my legacy lifecycle maps that I have, right? And it's sort of, if you haven't modified any of them, it gives you sort of out of box, how does this map into the stage status field, right? And if you had sort of done a lot more optimization or kind of customization in terms of operational field, this is the screen where you can come in and map that field that you've defined into something in kind of stage status, right? And once you activate it, it actually does a bidirectional sync whereby you now have this more consistent lifecycle stage status without having to get rid of all the stuff you already have, and it gives you more of a slow roll into just leveraging stage status in the future in order to leverage data manager, right? And the key item is that data manager is all about automating your lifecycle management, and if you don't have a consistent way to kind of specify that, then it kind of can't do its job. And then the final item here is, like, I know a lot of folks said they were not aware of what data manager is, right? So data manager was released a couple of releases ago, right? It's a completely free feature, right? And what it helps customers to do is sort of define, retire, archive, delete policies, right? That automatically clean up the CMDB, right? It actually does a lot more, like it does attestation, it does dependency cleanup and the likes, but the key things we released this for was sort of the retire, archive, delete, functionality. And here's a great example here, be like, if you wanted the container example I mentioned, right? In order to make sure like you don't have overwhelm with containers, you can actually go set up a policy saying, I'm going to target all containers that have been on a state equals retired, and I'm going to archive them. And I'm going to save that for, I don't know, like 2 years, right? It's a policy you can create and just press go. And what happens is, like, incrementally, right? Again, you can set up how often you want to go do this. Let's say every couple of hours, it goes and, kind of finds all the containers that are sort of been retired and it archives them essentially, right? And then you can sort of do a lot of these different types of policies, right? Whereby, again, a lot of the burden of keeping the CMDB healthy, and not with a lot of junk is up to this feature and not the user having to maintain this day in and day out, right? Again, highly, kind of useful feature, but it does have that prerequisite of defining some of your, state status, just so we don't go and do something terrible. Let's talk next about, again, like I said, one other thing I want to talk about is, like, even with the life cycle, is that there is a way to kind of track these open policies, right, from a user perspective, as well as from an admin perspective, right? So again, that's all about, you don't have to do this every day. You don't need to spend hours on it. It's just like when things are, about to happen, there is some, kind of task that get created for the various folks, and they can just look at it, review it, approve it, right? And sort of it goes on its merry way, right? That's really how we want to sort of make it as automated as possible. I don't know, run out of time very quickly, so let me talk about data completeness. Data completeness, as the name implies, is going to be, for certain use cases, you need to sort of define what data do we need, right? It's not 167 different attributes to be populated, but it is not none either, right? So this is really a place in terms of defining what is required, so you can understand where you're not making that requirement, right? And remediate them as needed. So first step is really understanding, how do I define what attributes are required? Very use case specific, like I mentioned, right? For asset management case, you don't necessarily need a support group, right? But if you're doing ITSM, support group is a must, right? So that's what I'm talking about in terms of that requirement. Second is, for some of these, discover an automated way to sync that data, so you're not having to manage these, one by one on a CI, right? So that's something just to pay attention to. Third is that, you would need to sort of identify key sort of attributes that need human verification, right? Like, for example, like how much RAM do you have, right? Not something you want human verification, right? But you may want a verification saying, hey, is this support group on these bunch of servers still correct, right? So now, like, this is really about, like, how do you identify those, and then how do you set it up so that there's a workflow for this rather than, again, having to do manually. So let's get into a little bit of the deep dive here. And, one functionality here in terms of, once you've sort of identified, let's say, your non-discoverable fields that are required, is that we do provide you a way to sort of have these populated, right? And this is really up to using sort of dynamic CI groups, right? Which are sort of a way you can sort of logically group different types of CIs together, right? And then second is connect that to a technical service offering. An example here would be like, if I have, servers in Seattle and servers in, let's say, San Diego, right? I could create, two different dynamic groups that say, hey, these are all the servers in Seattle. These are a different group with all the servers in San Diego. And as servers come in and out, right, it sort of automatically gets updated. And I connect that to, technical service offering saying, hey, this is a support group. This is a managed by group for those, kind of service offering, right? And then that data is automatically synced to whichever CIs are part of that service offering, right? That's kind of the beauty of, kind of automating some of these things and managing it at a higher meta level rather than having to do at each CI level, right? One gotcha there is that it does not use relationship there, right? It's more or less, it's not creating a relationship from a service offering to each CI. Rather, it goes through the dynamic CI groups, which gives us a lot more flexibility and fungibility in terms of how that would work. Next is really about the verification workflow, right? So there is a feature called data certification, which should be used for this purpose. An example of how this would work is like, you would go create a schedule saying, go verify all my, computers, right? That my PCs that I want to sort of use for software asset management, and make sure, let's say in this example, that the location is correct, right? And then the way you would do is that you set up that policy and you schedule, say, hey, I have, I want to make sure it goes to, let's say, the managed by group to sort of verify this data, right? And then second, you can set up things like, hey, report on this, you have sort of 90 days to do this job, right? So once you set it up, you click it off, what happens is that task gets created for the different folks within that managed by group that would need to go approve or verify the location, right? They can provide feedback right there in terms of if it is correct or not correct. And then finally, there's a data certification dashboard you can get to, right? Where you can keep track, not just from a user perspective, in terms of admin perspective, what are the different certifications, where is it at, right? And from a user perspective, what are things that's due for me, right? Again, goal being, yeah, this does require some human, intervention, but how do you make it so you can swarm on it? It's automated, it's workflowed, so that it's not, a lot of time and effort to do this, all the time. Similarly, in terms of, sort of required and, some of these required attributes, there is something called completeness in the, CMDB health dashboard. It is for this purpose, right? You need to go, define what is required on actually a table level, right? And this is really about, if I want to create a record in CMDB, what are the required attributes? That's where it gets the required. And you can add recommended on top of this saying, hey, these are some of the recommended fields, right? And then net is like, once you've set this up in Class Manager, right, per class, what happens is that, you can do a follow-on task when things are not there, right? So that they become a remediation task for somebody to go help and go, fix, right? So that's another key part of the health dashboard. Again, so the last key point here is data audit. What does data audit really mean? Data audit is really in one of the examples I mentioned, right? It's like, okay, I want to make sure there's no Windows 95 server running in my environment, right? You can leverage the CMDB to actually find those areas and then create, kind of follow-on tasks to go remediate them, right? And this is very much, dependent, obviously, on a customer. I have a lot of customers who have, very strict, PCI requirement. So they're trying to make sure, some of these, these applications that are sort of PCI requirement have much more stringent, audit in terms of what software is installed, what software is not installed, right? But, this, is something obviously everybody needs to pay attention to. The good news here is again, we do not want to make this sort of, needle in a haystack again, right? So we actually have ability to set these things as policies where you can sort of go and set up a policy saying, go find me any server that's running, Windows 95 as an example, right? And go send that to the support group to go and, decomp, hopefully in this case, and not update the software, right? But those are some things you can do, right? And then the key things here would be like, you set up a policy based on what's required, right? Second is like you can set up your, data audit policies. And then third would be you would need to go remediate it, right, from the different groups and just keep track of it. So what this looks like is in two different states, right? One is called desired state audit. And here what you do is really create a filter in terms of, what CI you want a particular policy to be applied against. You actually create and sort of figure out which sys group or user you want to assign the remediation task to. And then you actually create an audit. And it could be something like something is installed, something doesn't have a relationship, the RAM value is less than desired, lots of, flexibility there, right? But this is where you set it up. And you can do this on demand or schedule it to run once a quarter, once a day, once a year, however, whatever makes sense, right? That's key point one. Second is, scripted audit, which does the same thing, but it is really can be very, very complex, right? And it is really about, you can actually script some of these queries, right? And make it very, very customized to exactly what you're doing, right? And I've seen customers use both of them, right? Within the same environment. For some of the basic ones, they would use desired state audit. And then when they really want to focus on very, very specific things, they will switch on to, scripted audit. And both of these items, do show up in compliance, right? In the health dashboard, there's a compliance section. And, what that really is any of the audits that fail that you've defined from a scripted audit or desired state audit will show up within the compliance dashboard saying those are failures and here are some remediation tasks that have been assigned, right? Again, so it's a single place where you can look at completeness, compliance, correctness, but it's all there, and please do leverage them. And similar to what I showed you before, there is this compliance dashboard as well, which actually has a really high level, right? And, it sort of captures, everything from what's going on with different, audits, where the failures are, when things are gonna, kind of complete and so on and so forth, right? Again, this bird's eye view, so you're not sort of, looking through individual records individually. And then final show of hand here is really going to be sort of a CMDB data foundation and CSDM data foundation dashboard, right? These are, unlike the health dashboard, a store app, and it actually comes pre-populated with data points, meaning these are more, prescribed things from ServiceNow in terms of how do I look at somebody's CMDB health, right? Again, it's not going to be, it's not slice and dice on a particular, CI. It's going to look at everything, right? And again, there may be situations where, you don't necessarily need some of the things it's asking for, right? But the net is like, this is going to be, if you haven't done it yet, this is a very good high level view of where you are in your CMDB health. And then more importantly, it also gives you remediation tasks and even remediation services that are attached to some of these, kind of metrics we're collecting, right? So again, I would sort of highly recommend leveraging them. So I'm totally out of time, but I'm just going to show you two slides here, and then we'll continue, right? And this is going to be part of the presentation, so you can go check it out after the fact as well, right? So what I have here is sort of really highlighting sort of 5 things you need for overall sort of visibility success, right? Meaning, if your use case is like, hey, I want to make CMDB the system of record, which is for many customers absolutely true, right? How do we recommend you go about, and some of the 5 things you really need to do to be successful there, right? I don't have time to go through it individually here. Again, hopefully it's pretty, self-evident, but again, take that into account. Similarly, if you're really looking at IT asset management, these are also sort of the 5 things we recommend you must do, right? We should definitely, go through this and, understand and read this. And again, if you have any questions, do put it in the forum, and I can absolutely come answer some of those questions, any of these topics there may be. And the final item here is like, for 5 things for ITSM or event management success, right? Same things, right? These are sort of the things we say are absolutely required for you to be successful, right? And again, it's not just these, but these are sort of the foundational pieces that you need to sort of pay attention to. So with that, that was, kind of the end of my presentation. Again, I do appreciate everybody bearing through. I know there's a lot of content there. So again, but really, really appreciate everybody's time.
And thanks again for participating in this session. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session.